USS Langley began as a Navy collier named Jupiter before conversion transformed her into America's first aircraft carrier in 1922. At 11,500 tons, with a flush wooden flight deck bolted atop her original hull, Langley could operate just 34 biplanes. Her crew nicknamed her the Covered Wagon for her ungainly silhouette, but she proved shipboard aviation was viable. Langley trained the Navy's first carrier pilots and developed essential deck procedures that would define naval warfare for a century. She was sunk by Japanese bombers in 1942, but everything that followed began with her. Converted from a battlecruiser hull under the Washington Naval Treaty, USS Lexington emerged in 1927 as a 36,000-ton giant unlike anything the Navy had seen. She could launch 78 aircraft, making her one of the most powerful carriers in the world, and her massive size allowed the kind of tactical experimentation that shaped carrier doctrine for a generation. Lexington went down fighting at the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, the first carrier versus carrier engagement in history. Her crew fought for hours before abandoning ship. She proved, in sinking, that carriers had replaced battleships as the decisive weapons of naval war. USS Saratoga shared Lexington's battlecruiser origins and 36,000-ton displacement, but wrote a very different story. Commissioned in 1927, she operated 78 aircraft and became a floating laboratory for carrier tactics throughout the 1930s. Where Lexington died early, Saratoga endured, absorbing multiple torpedo hits across 3 years of Pacific combat and returning to service each time. She launched strikes from Pearl Harbor to Iwo Jima, surviving the war only to be expended as a nuclear test target at Bikini Atoll in 1946. Even then, the blast couldn't sink her immediately. She finally slipped beneath the surface hours after the explosion. America's first purpose-designed carrier, USS Ranger, commissioned in 1934, at just 14,500 tons, was also her greatest early miscalculation. Treaty constraints forced compromises on armor, speed, and protection, leaving a ship too slow and vulnerable for Pacific combat. Her 76 aircraft capacity impressed on paper, but the limitations kept her confined to the Atlantic throughout World War II, where she launched strikes against Vichy French forces in North Africa. Ranger proved that treaty-driven economy produced inadequate warships, a lesson that directly shaped the superior Yorktown class that followed her. Where Ranger disappointed, USS Yorktown delivered. Commissioned in 1937 at 19,800 tons, she carried 90 aircraft at 32 knots, balancing speed, protection, and striking power in a way no American carrier had managed before. Yorktown's design became the template for wartime carrier construction. She fought at Coral Sea, absorbing a bomb hit and returning to battle within days. At Midway, in June 1942, Japanese dive bombers finally sent her down. But not before her aircraft had turned the battle, sinking 3 Japanese carriers in a single morning. Yorktown's sacrifice helped change the course of the Pacific War. No American warship earned more battle honors than USS Enterprise. Commissioned in 1938 as the second Yorktown-class carrier, the Big E fought in virtually every major Pacific engagement: Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. At 19,800 tons, carrying 90 aircraft, she absorbed bomb hits, torpedo strikes, and kamikaze attacks that would have finished lesser ships. The Japanese reported her sunk 6 separate times, earning her a second nickname, the Grey Ghost. Enterprise earned 20 battle stars, more than any other U.S. vessel, before being decommissioned in 1947. America's most decorated warship was sold for scrap in 1958. USS Wasp was built smaller than the Yorktowns specifically to use the remaining treaty tonnage allowance, a budget decision that cost lives. Commissioned in 1940 at 14,700 tons, she lacked the armor and damage control redundancy of larger carriers, despite operating 84 aircraft. Wasp ferried Spitfires to besieged Malta before transferring to the Pacific, where a Japanese submarine put 3 torpedoes into her off Guadalcanal in September 1942. Uncontrollable fires consumed the ship within hours. Her loss reinforced a lesson the Navy was already learning. Carrier survivability required size, armor, and redundant systems that treaty limits had never allowed. USS Hornet launched the war's most audacious strike. In April 1942, she carried 16 Army B-25 bombers to within 650 miles of Tokyo, aircraft too large to land back aboard, for the Doolittle raid that shocked Japan and lifted American morale after Pearl Harbor. At 19,800 tons, Hornet fought through Midway before absorbing a catastrophic series of torpedo and bomb hits at the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942. Her crew abandoned ship, but she refused to sink. American destroyers eventually had to scuttle her as Japanese forces approached. She had served just 18 months. No ship in those months accomplished more. USS Essex gave the Navy something it desperately needed: a carrier that could be mass-produced without sacrificing capability. Commissioned in 1942 at 27,100 tons, carrying 90 to 100 aircraft, Essex launched a class of 24 ships that formed the backbone of America's Pacific offensive. Her improved damage control, enhanced anti-aircraft batteries, and greater fuel capacity addressed every lesson from earlier losses. The Navy also rushed 9 Independence-class light carriers into service from cruiser hulls, adding fast, flexible air power that Essex-class fleet carriers alone couldn't provide. Together, they overwhelmed Japan with numbers no single nation could match. USS Intrepid earned her nickname the hard way. Commissioned in 1943 as an Essex-class carrier, the Fighting One absorbed 5 separate kamikaze hits across the Pacific campaign, plus a torpedo strike that flooded her steering rooms. Each time, her crew fought fires and flooding to bring her back into action. At 27,100 tons, Intrepid launched strikes against Truk, the Philippines, and Okinawa, before returning home with 11 battle stars and a reputation for absorbing punishment that other ships simply couldn't take. She survived the war, survived scrapping proposals, and today serves as a museum ship on the Hudson River. No American carrier survived worse. Off Okinawa in March 1945, 2 Japanese bombs penetrated USS Franklin's flight deck and detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. The explosions killed 724 men and wounded 265 more in minutes. Franklin listed 13 degrees, dead in the water, while fires burned for hours. Her captain refused to abandon ship. The crew fought the fires manually as the burning carrier drifted toward Japanese waters. Somehow, they saved her. Franklin limped 12,000 miles home under her own power, the most heavily damaged American carrier to survive World War II. She never returned to combat, but her crew's tenacity became the Navy's benchmark for damage control. USS Bunker Hill had fought across the Pacific for 18 months when 2 kamikazes struck within 30 seconds of each other off Okinawa in May 1945. The attacks killed 346 men and wounded 264, igniting fires that threatened the entire ship. Her crew battled the flames for hours, flooding compartments and jettisoning burning aircraft over the side. Bunker Hill survived, but she was too damaged for further combat. At 27,100 tons, she'd proven that even well-designed Essex-class carriers remained vulnerable to determined suicide attacks. A lesson that would drive naval aircraft design for decades. Between 1943 and 1944, American shipyards completed 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers, in just 36 months, one ship every 18 days. Each displaced 7,800 tons and carried 27 aircraft, converted from merchant hulls in a production achievement that remains staggering. Slow, unarmored, and vulnerable, these small carriers nevertheless provided essential air cover for Pacific amphibious operations and anti-submarine patrols that fleet carriers couldn't spare time for. At Leyte Gulf, 3 Casablanca-class jeep carriers faced a Japanese surface fleet of battleships and cruisers, and somehow survived. Their mass production numbers overwhelmed every Axis calculation about American industrial limits. USS Midway was commissioned in September 1945, 1 week after Japan formally surrendered. At 45,000 tons, with an armored flight deck and capacity for 137 aircraft, she was the most powerful carrier ever built, arriving just as the war she was designed to fight ended. Midway adapted. She received an angled deck, steam catapults, and eventually operated F-4 Phantoms and A-6 Intruders through successive modernizations spanning 4 decades. She launched strikes against Iraq in Desert Storm in 1991, 46 years after commissioning. Her career proved that large, fundamentally sound designs could adapt to generations of aircraft and conflict. USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, the second Midway-class carrier, commissioned in late 1945 at 45,000 tons, spent 32 years projecting American power across the Cold War's most dangerous flashpoints. She deployed repeatedly to the Mediterranean, operating jets through multiple modernizations that pushed her World War II hull to its limits. Roosevelt launched aircraft during the Lebanon crisis and flew patrols off Libya before decommissioning in 1977. Her career demonstrated something important about the Midway design. It could absorb jet aviation, but each modernization revealed the growing gap between what 1940s hulls could offer and what modern operations demanded. The last of the original Midway class in frontline service, USS Coral Sea was commissioned in 1947 and served for an extraordinary 43 years. At 45,000 tons, she received an angled deck and enclosed bow before deploying to Vietnam, where her aircraft flew thousands of combat sorties. She returned to service through the 1980s, eventually operating 4th-generation FA-18 Hornets from a hull designed when propeller aircraft was standard. Coral Sea finally decommissioned in 1990, the longest-serving Midway-class carrier, outlasting both her sisters by years. Her service record is a testament to how far a good, basic design can stretch. USS Forrestal changed everything. Commissioned in 1955 as the first supercarrier built from the keel up for jet operations, she established the template every American carrier would follow for the next 7 decades. At 60,000 tons and 1,039 feet long, Forrestal featured an angled deck, 4 steam catapults, deck edge elevators, and the ability to operate 90 aircraft, including heavy attack jets, impossible on earlier designs. Her size created capability no previous carrier could match. In 1967, a fire sparked by an accidentally discharged rocket killed 134 men off Vietnam, a disaster that transformed damage control and safety procedures across the entire fleet. USS Kitty Hawk served longer than any other American carrier in history. Commissioned in 1961 as an improved Forrestal-class ship, she operated 5 generations of carrier aircraft across 48 years, from propeller-driven aircraft through F-14 Tomcats to F/A-18 Super Hornets. At 60,100 tons, she launched combat missions over Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, serving through 9 presidencies and 3 separate American wars. Kitty Hawk was the last oil-fired carrier in U.S. service, finally decommissioned in 2009. Her extraordinary longevity demonstrated what continuous modernization could accomplish, and set a standard of service that even nuclear carriers will struggle to match. Nuclear propulsion transformed the carrier from a powerful warship into a global instrument of policy. USS Enterprise, commissioned in 1961 as the world's first nuclear-powered carrier, demonstrated the difference immediately. At 93,500 tons, powered by 8 reactors, she could steam for years without refueling, operating anywhere on the planet without logistical constraints that limited conventional carriers. Enterprise's 1,123-foot flight deck operated 90 aircraft across 6 decades and 25 deployments to Vietnam, the Middle East, and Afghanistan. She served 51 years before decommissioning in 2012, the longest career of any American carrier, proving the nuclear concept beyond any reasonable doubt. USS. America's distinction was unique and controversial. She is the only carrier in history deliberately sunk by her own navy. Commissioned in 1965 as the last conventionally powered American supercarrier, she served 32 years, launching strikes in Vietnam, the Gulf of Sidra, and Desert Storm, while operating successive generations of naval aircraft. After decommissioning in 1996, the Navy used America as a live-fire test target for 25 days, subjecting her to explosives and weapons testing to gather survivability data for the new Ford-class design. She sank in May 2005. No carrier gave more, even at the end. USS Nimitz leads a class of 10 nuclear supercarriers that have defined American naval power for 5 decades. Commissioned in 1975 at 97,000 tons, with 2 reactors providing unlimited range, Nimitz established the design standard that would remain essentially unchanged through the class's final ship in 2009. She has deployed worldwide: Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf, Western Pacific, launching combat operations and projecting presence through crises from Iran to Afghanistan. The backbone of US naval power for over 50 years, Nimitz remains in service today, continuously modernized with new radar, weapon systems, and aircraft that her designers in the 1960s could barely have imagined. USS Carl Vinson will be remembered for one morning in May 2011. After Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, the Al-Qaeda leader's body was transported to Carl Vinson in the North Arabian Sea for burial at sea, a decision made specifically to prevent any grave from becoming a shrine. The carrier's location and the operation remained classified for hours. At 97,000 tons, Carl Vinson has spent 4 decades launching combat strikes and conducting freedom of navigation operations. She has undergone a full nuclear refueling overhaul, extending her service to 50 years. History, however, will record her for that quiet morning at sea. USS. Theodore Roosevelt became the most publicly visible carrier of the 21st century for reasons no one anticipated. In March 2020, COVID-19 swept through her crew while deployed in the Pacific, infecting hundreds of sailors. Her captain sent a letter requesting urgent assistance that leaked to the press. He was subsequently relieved of command. Roosevelt made emergency port in Guam while the Navy grappled with an unprecedented threat. At 97,000 tons, she had launched strikes in Desert Storm, Bosnia, and against ISIS without incident. She returned to operations months after the COVID crisis, but the episode permanently changed how the Navy manages biological threats aboard deployed warships. USS. Abraham Lincoln earned historical notoriety twice. During Desert Storm in 1991, she deployed to the Persian Gulf for combat operations that helped liberate Kuwait. Then, in May 2003, President George W. Bush landed on her flight deck to deliver his "Mission Accomplished" speech, declaring the end of major combat operations in Iraq. A moment that became one of the most politically debated images of the war, as the conflict continued for years afterward. At 97,000 tons, Lincoln completed a 4-year refueling overhaul that extended her service life to 2054. She will still be operating when sailors not yet born today join her crew. USS George Washington became the first nuclear carrier permanently home-ported outside the United States. Commissioned in 1992, she deployed to Yokosuka, Japan in 2008, replacing conventionally powered USS Kitty Hawk and providing continuous American presence in the Western Pacific for 7 years. At 97,000 tons, Washington responded to regional crises, conducted freedom of navigation operations through contested waters, and demonstrated that nuclear carriers could maintain indefinite overseas presence. A strategic capability conventional carriers requiring regular fuel stops simply couldn't match. She returned to the US for her midlife refueling before deploying again, her forward presence mission proving the concept for all future Pacific deployments. USS Harry S. Truman has spent her career at the center of difficult decisions. Commissioned in 1998, she deployed to the Persian Gulf for operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, then to the Mediterranean for strikes against ISIS. In 2019, the Trump administration proposed decommissioning Truman at just 21 years old to save money, a proposal Congress rejected as strategically incoherent given the cost of her construction and decades of service remaining. At 97,000 tons, Truman represents the mature Nimitz-class design refined over 25 years of building. She continues deploying today, her near retirement a reminder that fleet-size decisions carry consequences that outlast any budget cycle. USS Ronald Reagan has stood watch in the Pacific for 2 decades. Commissioned in 2003 and forward deployed to Yokosuka since 2008, Reagan provides continuous American presence at the strategic center of great power competition with China. At 97,000 tons, operating the most advanced carrier air wing in service, she responds to North Korean provocations, reassures treaty allies from Japan to the Philippines, and conducts operations that deter the kind of aggression that her namesake president spent a career opposing. Reagan represents American commitment to the Pacific in the most tangible form possible. 100,000 tons of nuclear-powered presence that cannot be ignored. USS George H.W. Bush, commissioned in 2009, is the 10th and final Nimitz-class carrier, the culmination of a design that began with USS Nimitz 34 years earlier. At 97,000 tons, Bush incorporated every lesson learned across 9 previous ships: a bulbous bow for improved fuel efficiency, upgraded launch and recovery systems, enhanced survivability features, and refined crew arrangements that reduced manning requirements. She has deployed to the Mediterranean and Persian Gulf, launching strikes against ISIS and conducting operations that the first Nimitz-class carriers would have required more ships to accomplish. Bush bridges 50 years of nuclear carrier evolution to the generation that follows. USS Gerald R. Ford represents the most significant carrier advancement since Enterprise introduced nuclear propulsion in 1961. Commissioned in 2017 at 100,000 tons, Ford replaced steam catapults with electromagnetic launch systems, introduced advanced arresting gear, incorporated dual-band radar, and reduced crew requirements by 600 sailors through automation. Her systems generate 3 times the electrical power of Nimitz-class ships, enabling future directed energy weapons. Ford's development was troubled. Cost overruns exceeded estimates, and technical problems delayed full operational capability by years. But she is now operational, carrying proven technologies that will define American carrier aviation for the next half-century. USS John F. Kennedy, the second Ford-class carrier, represents the program's maturation. Commissioned in 2024, Kennedy incorporated lessons from Ford's difficult development, refined electromagnetic catapults, improved weapons elevators that plagued her predecessor, and cost reductions that brought her price below Ford's final figure. At 100,000 tons, Kennedy will operate F-35C Lightning IIs alongside future unmanned combat aircraft, projecting power in an era defined by competition with China and Russia. From Langley's wooden flight deck in 1922 to Kennedy's electromagnetic catapults a century later, American carrier aviation has continuously reinvented itself and shows no sign of stopping. The Maine was not technically a battleship. She was ordered in 1886 as an armored cruiser, reclassified as a second-class battleship when she proved too slow to serve as a cruiser, and sent to Havana Harbor in January 1898 on a mission officially described as a courtesy visit. On the night of February 15th, an explosion tore through her forward magazines, and she sank with 266 men. The cause has never been conclusively determined. A naval court of inquiry blamed an external mine. Later investigations suggested an internal accident. The newspapers blamed Spain. Whatever destroyed the Maine, the result was the same. The United States declared war on Spain 2 months later, and the age of American naval power had begun. The war that followed would be fought partly by a ship wrestling with the same identity crisis. USS Texas was authorized in 1886 as one of the first modern warships the United States had attempted to build in a generation. The Navy had let its fleet deteriorate so thoroughly after the Civil War that it had to relearn shipbuilding almost from scratch, and Texas showed it. She had a low freeboard that made her wet in any sea, turrets that could not safely fire together on the same side, and armor thinner than comparable European designs. She fought at Santiago de Cuba in 1898 anyway, running down the Spanish cruiser Vizcaya. Texas survived and is preserved today in San Jacinto, the oldest surviving American battleship in existence. While Texas was learning what American warships could and could not do in combat, the Navy was already building something more serious. The 3 Indiana-class ships, Indiana, Massachusetts, and Oregon, were the first American battleships designed from the outset for ocean service. They carried 4 13-inch guns in centerline turrets, enough armor to qualify as genuine capital ships, and a serious problem with freeboard. The designers kept the hull low to reduce the target presented to enemy fire, and the result was a ship that threw spray across its main deck in moderate seas. Oregon's famous voyage from San Francisco around Cape Horn to join the Atlantic Fleet in 1898, 14,000 miles in 66 days, made her a national hero. It also demonstrated that the ship could survive passages her design had never quite anticipated. The Navy's solution to the Indiana's limitations produced one of the stranger arrangements in American naval architecture. The 2 Kearsarge-class ships mounted 8-inch guns directly on top of the 13-inch main battery turrets, both rotating together. The theory was that this saved weight and kept the secondary battery protected. The practice was that firing the main guns created blast effects that made the secondary guns temporarily unusable. Kearsarge herself was eventually demilitarized and converted into a crane ship, serving in that role until 1955, outlasting by decades the battleship era she had helped open. She was the only American battleship named for a Civil War vessel, rather than a state, by act of Congress. The lessons of Indiana and Kearsarge produced the 3 Illinois-class ships, Illinois, Alabama, and Wisconsin, a cleaner development of the earlier concept with improved freeboard, a more rational secondary battery, and better seakeeping. Alabama was used as a target vessel in 1921 during the bombing trials conducted by General Billy Mitchell, in which Army Air Service bombers demonstrated they could sink capital ships from the air. The results began a debate about the future of the battleship that would not be resolved until Pearl Harbor proved the argument definitively 20 years later. The Illinois class closed one chapter. The Maine class, not the armored cruiser, but the three battleships, BB-10 Maine, BB-11 Missouri, and BB-12 Ohio, opened the next. Built between 1899 and 1904, they were larger and better armed than anything that had come before, carrying 4 12-inch guns in a hull that finally gave American sailors enough freeboard to fight in Atlantic weather. They were the most capable pre-dreadnought battleships the United States had yet produced. They would also be almost immediately obsolete, because HMS Dreadnought was already being designed in London, and everything that had come before her was about to become irrelevant. Before that revolution arrived, the Navy built more. The 5 Virginia-class ships, Virginia, Nebraska, Georgia, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, were authorized in 1899 and completed between 1904 and 1906. They carried the same superimposed turret concept that had failed in the Kearsarge class, this time combining 8-inch guns mounted above the 12-inch main battery. The arrangement still did not work well in practice. Secondary battery fire was disrupted by main battery blast, and the ships were complex to operate. The Virginias served their time and were scrapped after World War I, leaving behind the lesson that complicated arrangements rarely survive contact with the reality of naval combat. The 6 Connecticut-class ships that followed were the largest and most powerful American pre-dreadnoughts ever built. Connecticut, Louisiana, Vermont, Kansas, Minnesota, and New Hampshire were commissioned between 1906 and 1908, representing the final refinement of everything the Navy had learned in the pre-dreadnought era. In 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt assembled 16 of the Navy's most modern battleships, including the Connecticuts, into the Great White Fleet, and sent them on a 14-month voyage around the world. The message was deliberate. The United States had arrived as a naval power. The timing was almost ironic. The fleet was still at sea when Dreadnought rendered every ship in it obsolete. The last 2 pre-dreadnoughts were also the most consequential in ways nobody anticipated. USS Mississippi and USS Idaho, BB-23 and BB-24 were completed in 1908 and sold to Greece in 1914, where they were renamed Kilkis and Lemnos. In April 1941, German Junkers Ju-88 bombers found them in Salamis Harbor and sank both ships in a single attack. 2 American-built battleships sold to an ally, destroyed by a nation the United States would be at war with before the year was out. The Mississippi class ended not in a scrapyard, but in an air raid, the last pre-dreadnoughts lost in combat anywhere in the world. When HMS Dreadnought was commissioned in 1906, she made every battleship in the world obsolete overnight, including the Connecticuts America had just finished building. The response from the United States Navy was the South Carolina class, the first American all-big-gun battleships. South Carolina and Michigan carried 8 12-inch guns in 4 centerline turrets, all capable of firing on either broadside, a super-fire arrangement that would define American battleship design for the next 3 decades. They were constrained by the dimensions of the Panama Canal locks that Congress insisted they be able to transit. But the layout was right, and it established the template every subsequent American battleship would follow. The South Carolinas proved the concept. The Delaware class proved the Navy was serious. Delaware and North Dakota, completed in 1910, were significantly larger, carried 10 12-inch guns, and introduced turbine propulsion to American battleship design. North Dakota was used as a trial ship for different propulsion systems throughout her career, her engineers comparing turbine arrangements while the rest of the Navy watched. The Delaware class established that the United States could build dreadnoughts matching European designs in size, speed, and firepower. not just in theory, but in steel. Florida and Utah followed in 1911, improvements on the Delaware design with detail refinements that reflected 2 more years of experience. Utah would have a longer and stranger story than any of her sisters. Demilitarized under the Washington Naval Treaty, she was converted into a target and training ship and was moored at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, where she was struck by 2 torpedoes and capsized. Utah was never salvaged. Her wreck remains on the floor of Pearl Harbor today, one of only 2 American warships still lying where they sank that morning. Wyoming and Arkansas, completed in 1912, were the largest American dreadnoughts yet built, and the first to carry 12 guns, a broadside that finally matched the most powerful British and German designs of the period. Arkansas survived both World Wars and was present at the Normandy landings in June 1944, her 14-inch guns providing shore bombardment for the troops on Omaha Beach. She was expended as a target at the Bikini Atoll atomic bomb tests in 1946, surviving the first test, sunk by the second. Wyoming outlasted her, serving as a training ship until 1947, the last American dreadnought to remain in service. With the New York class in 1912, American battleship design began moving toward the doctrine that would define a generation of capital ships. A generation of battleships built to the same tactical doctrine. Same speed, same turn, same fight. Every ship in the battle line would maneuver together, turn together, and fight together, without any vessel falling behind. Naval historians have grouped them ever since under a single name: the Standard battleships. New York and Texas, the class, not the earlier ship, introduced 14-inch guns to American battleship design. Texas is preserved today at La Porte, the last surviving dreadnought-era battleship in the world. Her sister, New York, was expended at Bikini in 1946 after surviving both world wars, a veteran that outlasted almost everything built in the same era. Nevada and Oklahoma introduced what became the defining feature of American capital ship design: the all-or-nothing armor scheme. Heavy armor over the vital spaces, nothing over the rest. The logic was that light armor could not stop a modern shell anyway. Nevada was hit by 1 torpedo and 6 bombs at Pearl Harbor, got underway, was beached, repaired, fought across the Pacific, supported the Normandy landings, and was expended at Bikini in 1946. Oklahoma capsized at Pearl Harbor and never returned to service. Pennsylvania and Arizona carried 12 14-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, the heaviest broadside any American battleship had yet fired. Arizona was struck by a bomb converted from a 16-inch naval shell on December 7th. It penetrated to her forward magazine. The resulting explosion was visible for miles. She sank in 9 minutes with 1,177 men. Her wreck has never been raised. The USS Arizona Memorial was dedicated above her hull in 1962 and receives more than 1 million visitors every year. The 3 New Mexico-class ships introduced turbo-electric propulsion, turbines generating electricity that drove motors connected to the propeller shafts, giving precise speed control and instant reversibility that mechanical drive systems could not match. New Mexico, Mississippi, and Idaho all survived World War II, serving across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters before being scrapped in the late 1940s. Tennessee and California were the most thoroughly rebuilt of all the Standard battleships after Pearl Harbor. Both were sunk or badly damaged on December 7th. California settled to the harbor bottom after flooding through open manholes that should have been sealed. And both were rebuilt so completely that they emerged from the yards in 1943 and 1944 as almost unrecognizable ships. They fought the entire Pacific campaign and were present at Surigao Strait in October 1944, the last battleship versus battleship gun engagement in history. Colorado and Maryland spent the war fighting across the Pacific. West Virginia, sunk at Pearl Harbor by 7 torpedo hits and 2 bombs, was raised, rebuilt more thoroughly than any other standard battleship, and returned to the Pacific in time for the Philippines campaign. All 3 were at Surigao Strait. The last battleship-to-battleship gun engagement in history was fought by standard battleships. Colorado and Maryland were scrapped in the early 1950s, their design philosophy superseded by ships fast enough to keep up with the carriers that had replaced them at the center of naval warfare. The standard battleships had barely finished commissioning when the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 shut the program down. 6 South Dakota-class ships, not the famous World War II class of the same name, but an earlier design authorized in 1917, were already under construction when the treaty was signed, some nearly 40% complete. All 6 were cancelled and broken up on their slips. The steel saved on those construction sites was later used in the World War II shipbuilding program. The 1920 South Dakotas would have been the most powerful battleships in the world when completed. 16-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, displacement approaching 50,000 tons. They never fired a shot. The treaty also forced a decision about the 6 Lexington-class battlecruisers already under construction. 4 were scrapped on their slips. 2 of the 6, Lexington and Saratoga, were converted into aircraft carriers rather than wasted. The conversion gave the United States its first large fleet carriers at a moment when carrier aviation was still working out its doctrine. And the 2 ships became the laboratories in which American naval aviators developed how carrier task forces should operate. Lexington was sunk at the Coral Sea in May 1942. Saratoga survived the war and was expended at Bikini in 1946. The 4 battlecruisers that were scrapped never had a chance to prove themselves. The 2 that became carriers helped determine the outcome of the Pacific War. When the treaty limitations eased in the mid-1930s, the result was the North Carolina class, the first American battleships commissioned since 1923. North Carolina and Washington were built to the treaty limit of 35,000 tons, armed with 9 16-inch guns and capable of 27 knots, fast enough to operate with carriers in a way the standard battleships never could. Washington sank the Japanese battleship Kirishima at Guadalcanal in November 1942 in a night engagement that lasted less than 7 minutes. North Carolina is preserved today in Wilmington. Washington was scrapped in 1961, her war record not enough to save her. The 4 South Dakota-class ships of 1939, South Dakota, Indiana, Massachusetts, and Alabama, were shorter than the North Carolinas, but more heavily armored on nearly identical displacement. South Dakota was hit by 27 shell hits at Guadalcanal in November 1942, while her fire control temporarily failed, absorbed every one of them, and stayed in action. Alabama and Massachusetts are preserved as museum ships today. The South Dakotas were considered by many who served in them to be the best balanced American battleships of the war, better protected than the North Carolinas, nearly as fast, and proven in the hardest kind of combat. The Iowa class was the final American battleship class actually completed, and it remains the most recognizable warship the United States Navy ever built. Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin were commissioned between 1943 and 1944. Each carrying 9 16-inch guns, able to throw a shell weighing as much as a small car more than 20 miles, and making 33 knots, fast enough to keep pace with any carrier in the fleet. Missouri was chosen as the site of the Japanese surrender ceremony on September 2, 1945. All 4 ships were reactivated for Korea, decommissioned, reactivated again in the 1980s with Tomahawk cruise missiles, and finally retired in the early 1990s. New Jersey fired her last combat rounds in Lebanon in 1984. All 4 survive as museum ships today. Iowa Quartet, last battleships afloat. The 5 Montana-class ships would have been larger than the Iowas in every dimension. 60,000 tons, 12 16-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, armor heavy enough to withstand the same shells they fired, and a beam too wide for the Panama Canal. Congress authorized all 5 in 1940. None were ever laid down. The demands of carrier construction and amphibious shipping made it impossible to justify the shipyard capacity the Montanas would have consumed. The class was cancelled in 1943 before a single keel plate had been cut. Montana remains the only one of the 48 contiguous states that never had a battleship named for it. The ship that would have carried her name was designed, funded, and erased before it could be built. The Alaska class occupied a category the Navy never quite resolved. Alaska and Guam were designated large cruisers, CB-1 and CB-2. But their 12-inch guns, their armor, and their cost placed them closer to capital ships than anything the cruiser designation normally implied. They were designed to hunt the supercruisers the Japanese and German planners had threatened to build, and they were fast, 33 knots, matching the Iowas. Neither Alaska nor Guam ever found the targets they were designed to engage. They spent the war screening carrier task forces and were decommissioned in 1947 after less than 4 years of service. The class answered a question about enemy supercruisers that the enemy never actually forced the Navy to ask. USS Kentucky, BB-66, was the last American battleship ever laid down. Her keel was placed on December 7, 1944, exactly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, at the Newport News shipyard. Construction continued slowly as the war ended and priorities shifted. Work was suspended in 1947, with the hull about 20% complete. The Navy studied converting her into a missile ship, a guided missile cruiser, a research vessel. None of the proposals were funded. Her bow was removed in 1956 and fitted to Wisconsin, which had lost her own in a collision. The rest of Kentucky was sold for scrap in 1958. The last American battleship died piece by piece, and the era that had begun in Havana Harbor ended in a shipbreaker's yard. The US Navy bought its first submarine on April 11, 1900, for $150,000, and then wasn't sure what to do with it. USS Holland spent most of her commissioned life as a training hulk at the Naval Academy. The Navy ordered 7 more boats from Holland's company before the first was even complete. These were the A-class, slightly larger, slightly better, built while the doctrine that would justify them was still entirely absent. America had acquired submarines. It had not acquired a reason for submarines. That distinction would take 25 years and dozens of hulls to resolve. For the next 15 years, the Navy built submarines alphabetically, incrementally, without a controlling idea. B was slightly larger than A. C was slightly larger than B. D through M followed the same logic. More range, more depth, more speed. Each class a marginal improvement on the one before. Some had gasoline engines, some had diesel. None were deployed in combat. The alphabet boats proved that a submarine could be built and operated by American crews. They did not prove what American submarines were supposed to accomplish in a war. The Navy had not yet answered that question. The S-class was the first American submarine built around a tactical idea rather than a technical experiment. Designed for fleet screening and coastal patrol, 51 boats were built between 1917 and 1925, the largest production run the Navy had attempted. They had proper diesel engines, ranges that sustained extended patrol, and crews trained for operations rather than exercises. S-boats served in both Atlantic and Pacific theaters in World War II, well past their intended life. They were never the right submarines for a Pacific war, but they were the first submarines the Navy thought of as a fleet asset rather than a novelty. The submarine had finally acquired a purpose, even if the purpose was still the wrong one. The V-boat program was the Navy's attempt to answer the Pacific. War planners in the 1920s looked at the distances between Hawaii, the Philippines, and Japan and understood that any future conflict would be fought across thousands of miles of open ocean, ranges that made European submarine doctrine useless. The solution was size. 9 boats across the Barracuda, Argonaut, Narwhal, and Dolphin subclasses, each designed to cross the Pacific independently and operate alongside the battle fleet. Argonaut carried mine-laying equipment. Narwhal could sustain months at sea. The ambition was real. The problem was doctrine. Naval planners still believed the decisive battle would be fought between surface fleets, with submarines supporting the battleships rather than replacing their strategic reach. The V-boats proved a submarine could cross an ocean. They could not prove what to do when it got there. The London Naval Treaty of 1930 imposed limits on submarine tonnage and forced a rethinking of the V-boat approach. The Cachalot class was the Navy's response. 2 smaller, cheaper boats. Dolphin was a single experimental design. These were submarines built by treaty constraint rather than operational requirement, and they looked like it. Neither the ocean raiders the V-boats had aspired to be, nor the standardized fleet weapons the coming decade would require. They explored what a medium-sized submarine could carry, how deep it could dive, how long it could remain at sea on reduced displacement. None of these boats defined the future. The Navy was still waiting for a war to tell it what submarines were actually for. The Porpoise and Salmon classes were the Navy's first genuine fleet submarines. Boats designed not as experiments or compromises, but as purpose-built ocean warfare platforms. Porpoise established the basic template: diesel-electric propulsion, 6 torpedo tubes, surface range sufficient to cross the Pacific. Salmon refined it. These were the boats that finally closed the gap between what the Navy needed and what its shipyards could build. Their crews developed the patrol doctrines that would carry through the entire war: independent ocean patrols, commerce interdiction, attack and withdrawal. American submarines were no longer coastal weapons. They were becoming oceanic predators. The Sargo class refined the endurance doctrine that would define American submarine strategy in the Pacific. 12 boats, built between 1937 and 1941, pushed diving depth to 250 feet, extended fuel and provisions for patrols exceeding 60 days, and improved habitability for crews who would spend months submerged in tropical waters. The Sargo class demonstrated that endurance was itself a strategic weapon. A submarine that could remain on station longer than its adversary expected could be everywhere the adversary wasn't looking. The Pacific War would prove this correct, repeatedly, at enormous cost to Japanese shipping. The Sargo class made the strategy possible. What happened next was a question of scale. The Tambour and Gar classes represented the standardization the Navy had been building toward since the alphabet boats. 10 Tambours, 6 Gars, the same basic design, refined and rationalized into a production-ready platform. 10 torpedo tubes, extended range, the flush deck that gave the boat a clean silhouette for high-speed surface transit. The Tambours and Gars were the submarines America went to war with in 1941, and they were ready for the mission in every way except one. The weapons they carried still didn't work. 2 classes of well-designed, well-crewed submarines spent the first year of the Pacific War unable to confirm kills against targets their commanders could clearly see. The platform had been perfected. The ordnance had not been tested under combat conditions. The Gato class was not the most advanced American submarine of World War II. It was the most important. 77 boats, built between 1941 and 1944 at 4 shipyards simultaneously, a production rate no other submarine program matched. By 1943, when the defective Mark 14 torpedo exploder was finally officially acknowledged and corrected, Gato-class submarines were sinking Japanese shipping at rates that disrupted supply chains across the Pacific. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk 55% of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost, with 2% of the naval personnel involved. The Gato was not a revolutionary design. It was a capable design that could be built fast enough, in numbers large enough, to turn submarine warfare into industrial strategy. The Balao class was the Gato made survivable. The critical change was hull steel, high tensile construction that extended test depth from 300 to 400 feet. In practical terms, that meant a submarine under attack could dive below the depth setting of most Japanese depth charges. 122 Balao-class boats were built, the largest American submarine class of the war. Their improved depth capability directly translated to crew survival. A submarine that could go deeper than its pursuers' weapons could reach had a fundamental tactical advantage that no amount of firepower could match. The Balao combined the Gato's proven production template with the margin of survivability that sustained operations in contested waters required. It was the backbone of the Pacific submarine campaign. The Tench class was the most refined American submarine of World War II. Improved hull, better batteries, more internal volume, greater range. 29 were completed before the war ended. They arrived too late to fight the war they were designed for. If you want to explore this further, links to recommended books and scale models are in the description below. The Tench was the endpoint of 6 years of engineering that had produced the most effective submarine force in history. And within a decade, everything that made it excellent – diesel-electric propulsion, surface transit doctrine, battery-limited endurance – would be strategically obsolete. The perfect design, the wrong era. The Navy would spend the next 10 years building the best diesel submarines it had ever produced, knowing they would never fight the war those submarines were designed for. The Tang class was the finest American diesel-electric submarine ever built, and the Navy knew, while building it, that diesel submarines were finished. Streamlined hull, snorkel mast, higher battery capacity. 6 Tang-class boats entered service in 1951 and 1952 as the definitive expression of everything the Pacific War had taught. The Data, a single experimental boat, pushed the concept further. These were brilliant solutions to a problem that nuclear propulsion was already making irrelevant. The Tang could not stay submerged for weeks. It could not outrun a surface ship on battery power alone. It could not operate under the Arctic ice without surfacing. The Navy was perfecting a technology in the precise years when a physicist in Idaho was making that technology obsolete. The Babel class was the last word in American conventional submarine design, and the Navy built it knowing there would be no next word. 3 boats, commissioned in 1959, introduced the teardrop hull to diesel submarines, the same revolutionary shape that would define nuclear design for decades. Babel could maneuver underwater like an aircraft, banking and climbing with precision no earlier hull could approach. She was faster submerged than any diesel submarine the Navy had ever operated. And she could still only stay down for hours before the batteries died and the snorkel had to come up. The Babel was a masterpiece, built at the moment mastery no longer mattered. The nuclear boats were already in the water. On January 17, 1955, Commander Eugene Wilkinson ordered the mooring lines cast off and sent 4 words to the submarine force commander: underway on nuclear power. In her shakedown cruise that May, USS Nautilus traveled 1,381 miles from New London to Puerto Rico, submerged, in 89 hours. 10 times farther than any submarine had previously covered without surfacing. The exercise that followed was more alarming than the record. Nautilus ran simulated attack runs against a NATO convoy, and the ASW forces couldn't find her. The radar, aircraft, and surface ships that had defined anti-submarine warfare since World War II were useless against a submarine that didn't need to surface. Every tactical assumption about submarine warfare became obsolete on January 17, 1955. The Skate class was the first attempt to make nuclear propulsion operationally routine rather than experimentally spectacular. 4 boats, commissioned between 1957 and 1959, were built to a practical specification. Smaller, cheaper, designed for fleet operations rather than records. USS Skate surfaced at the geographic North Pole in 1959. More important than the headline was what the class proved. Nuclear submarines could be produced on a shipyard schedule, maintained by ordinary crews, integrated into fleet operations. Nuclear propulsion was not a prototype capability. It was a production capability. The question was no longer whether nuclear submarines could be operated. It was whether diesel submarines could still justify their existence. Skipjack married the nuclear reactor to the teardrop hull, and the result changed submarine design permanently. 6 boats, entering service from 1959 to 1961, combined the S-5W reactor with the hydrodynamic hull pioneered by the experimental diesel USS Albacore. The result was a submarine that could exceed 30 knots submerged, more than twice the sustained speed of any World War II boat. Skipjack could reverse direction within its own length. It maneuvered underwater the way no surface-derived hull could approach. Every US nuclear attack submarine built after Skipjack used the same basic hull form. Speed had become doctrine. The Thresher class defined what the post-Skipjack nuclear attack submarine needed to become. Speed had been demonstrated. Now the priority was depth and lethality. USS Thresher was lost on April 10, 1963, during post-overhaul sea trials, with 129 men. The disaster triggered SubSafe, a complete overhaul of submarine construction and certification standards that fundamentally changed how American submarines were built. The Permit class that followed incorporated those lessons. They dove deeper, carried longer-range weapons, and were built around the acoustic detection suite that defined Cold War ASW. Thresher's loss was the most expensive lesson the submarine force ever paid. Every American nuclear submarine built since has been built to the standards that loss required. The Sturgeon class built the sensors-first submarine. 37 boats designed around the idea that finding the enemy before he found you was more valuable than any speed advantage. The BQQ-2 spherical sonar array, the towed array capability, the quiet skewback propeller. These engineering choices traded speed for acoustic dominance. Sturgeon could detect a Soviet submarine at ranges that made sprint speed irrelevant. If you hear it first, you don't need to chase it. 37 boats entered service between 1967 and 1975 and dominated American submarine operations through the Cold War's tensest decade. They were not the fastest submarines in the fleet. They were the most dangerous. And that distinction was not accidental. The Navy built 3 submarines in the 1960s and 70s that functioned as manned laboratories. USS Tullyby was built around the premise that a small, acoustically optimized boat could outperform a larger one. USS Narwhal tested a natural circulation reactor, eliminating the main coolant pumps that were a primary source of acoustic signature. USS Lipscomb tested turbo-electric drive that removed gearbox noise entirely. None became production classes. All 3 generated the engineering data that defined what came next. The quieting war was won not through any single breakthrough, but through systematic elimination of every noise source, one test hull at a time, across 15 years of classified experimentation. On July 20, 1960, USS George Washington surfaced briefly in the Atlantic and sent 4 words to the president. Polaris, from out of the deep to target. Perfect. 2 Polaris A-1 missiles had been launched from a submerged submarine for the first time in history, each striking a target 1,100 miles away. George Washington had been converted from an incomplete skipjack-class hull, a 130-foot missile compartment inserted during construction, and commissioned on December 30, 1959. She deployed on her first deterrent patrol on November 15, 1960, with 16 missiles. The balance of nuclear terror had shifted. A weapon that could not be located could not be preemptively destroyed. For the first time in history, the survival of nations depended on weapons hidden under the sea. The Lafayette and Benjamin Franklin classes turned deterrence into an institution. 31 boats across both classes, part of the 41 for Freedom that sustained continuous American SSBN patrols from 1960 onward. 2 crews per submarine, 60-day patrols. The moment one boat returned, another was already at depth, missiles armed, waiting. Soviet war planners could not contemplate a first strike without accounting for submarines they could not find, in oceans too vast to search, carrying warheads that would survive any attack on American soil. The Trident C-4 missiles that later armed the Benjamin Franklin boats extended range to 4,600 nautical miles, enough to patrol from the entire ocean. The deterrent worked because finding it meant searching everywhere at once. No navy had ever built a force whose strategic value depended on never being seen. The Ohio class was the strategic submarine the Cold War demanded. 18 boats, each carrying 24 Trident ballistic missiles, each missile capable of carrying multiple independently targetable warheads to ranges exceeding 7,000 nautical miles. A single Ohio-class submarine on patrol carried more destructive potential than all the conventional weapons fired in World War II combined. 14 remain in service as SSBNs. 4 were converted to SSGNs, guided missile submarines carrying 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles used for strike missions and special operations. The Ohio's conversion is the clearest statement of how deterrence requirements changed after the Cold War. Submarines built to prevent nuclear war were reconfigured to fight conventional ones. The Los Angeles class became the instrument through which America exercised undersea dominance for 30 years. 62 boats built from 1972 to 1996, faster than the Sturgeon class, quieter than Skipjack, capable under Arctic ice, armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles that extended submarine lethality from the ocean to any target on land within 1,500 miles. These were the submarines that tracked Soviet SSBNs from their home ports, penetrated denied waters for intelligence operations, and patrolled beneath the Arctic ice cap to gather data that shaped Cold War strategy. The later improved Los Angeles boats added a vertical launch system and under-ice bow planes. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Los Angeles class was in the water everywhere the Soviet fleet had operated. It outlasted the adversary it was built to fight, and then had to figure out what came next. Seawolf was designed to kill the most dangerous submarines the Soviet Union was building, and it was designed without a budget constraint. 8 torpedo tubes, 50 weapons aboard, a reactor generating 52,000 shaft horsepower, HY-100 steel for deeper test depth, acoustic cladding across the entire hull. 29 were planned. The Cold War ended. $3 billion per boat proved impossible to sustain without a clear adversary to justify it. 3 were built. 1, USS Jimmy Carter, was extended by 100 feet as a special operations and intelligence platform. The Seawolf is the most capable attack submarine ever built. It is also the most vivid demonstration that military procurement requires an enemy as much as it requires a budget. The Virginia class was designed specifically to avoid becoming what Seawolf had become. Fixed cost ceiling, modular construction across multiple shipyards, incremental technology insertion through planned block upgrades rather than redesign. Block 1 established the baseline. Block 2 reduced cost. Block 3 replaced 12 individual vertical launch tubes with 2 large diameter payload tubes. Block 5 added the Virginia Payload Module, a 70-foot hull section with 28 additional Tomahawks. USS Mississippi delivered in 2012, a year ahead of schedule, $60 million under budget. The Virginia class didn't just produce submarines. It produced a procurement method that the rest of American defense acquisition was told to study. The Columbia class is the next generation of American strategic deterrence. 12 submarines plan to replace the Ohio class as it ages out through the 2040s. The central engineering decision was the life-of-ship reactor, a nuclear core that will not require refueling for the submarine's entire 40-year service life. No midlife refueling means no years in the shipyard, no gap in deterrent coverage, no window of vulnerability. Columbia will carry 16 Trident 2D5 missiles in a hull engineered around a single requirement: that the submarine never be unavailable. American submarines did not simply evolve. From the $150,000 Holland that the Navy bought without knowing what to do with, to the trillion-dollar deterrent architecture that Columbia represents, they became the quiet infrastructure of global power. The Bainbridge class marked America's first purpose-built destroyers. At 420 tons, these ships were fragile experiments, coal-fired, barely seaworthy in rough Atlantic swells. They carried 2 3-inch guns and 2 torpedo tubes. The Navy called them torpedo boat destroyers, because that's exactly what they were built to hunt. Speed was the priority, 29 knots, but range was abysmal. Machinery broke constantly. These weren't warships yet. They were prototypes, testing whether America could even build this type of vessel. Within 15 years, America would build hundreds. But in 1902, even building 16 seemed doubtful. Bainbridge answered one question. Truxtun refined the answer. Slightly larger at 433 tons, marginally faster at 30 knots. The Navy was discovering that building destroyers required different thinking than building battleships. These were expendable scouts, not capital ships. Truxtun's engines were more reliable than Bainbridge's, but only marginally. The hull design improved seakeeping, though crews still reported brutal conditions in heavy weather. 2 ships, 2 years of operational data. The Navy was methodically documenting what worked and what failed. Engineering through iteration. Smith-class destroyers jumped to 700 tons. The Navy had learned that tiny ships couldn't survive Atlantic operations. 5 vessels were built, each with improved steam turbines, a critical technological leap. Turbines offered more power, less weight, and, crucially, less maintenance than reciprocating engines. Speed increased to 28 knots, though that seemed like a step backward. It wasn't. Reliability mattered more than raw speed. These ships could actually complete their missions. That counted more than theoretical maximum velocity. Doctrine was evolving, from chasing speed records to building ships that worked. While Smith tested turbines, Paulding brought standardization. 21 ships, all built to the same specification. This was America's first attempt at mass production in destroyer construction. Displacement held at 742 tons. Speed reached 29.5 knots. The class introduced oil-fired boilers on some vessels, another technological experiment. Oil burned hotter, stored more efficiently, and eliminated coal-handling crews. But America's oil infrastructure was underdeveloped. Most Pauldings kept coal. The class served through World War I, proving that quantity had its own quality. Numbers were starting to matter. Paulding brought numbers. Monaghan brought efficiency. 16 near-identical vessels at 742 tons and 29.5 knots. The Navy was refining production techniques, not design. What changed was construction time. Shipyards were learning efficiency, cutting steel faster, assembling machinery quicker, training workers better. This was industrial learning, not naval architecture. Monaghan proved America could sustain destroyer production at scale. 6 years later, they'd need to build 200. Cassin introduced the raised forecastle, a simple design change with profound implications. The higher bow kept the forward deck drier in heavy seas, making the ships more habitable and the forward gun more usable. 8 ships were built, displacing 1,010 tons and reaching 29 knots. Armament increased to 4 4-inch guns. Torpedo tubes increased to 8. Destroyers needed to fight other destroyers, not just torpedo boats. The mission was expanding beyond coastal defense to fleet operations. Cassin marked that transition. Aylwin-class destroyers were Cassin variants. 6 ships, same displacement, same speed, same armament. The differences were minor, but the purpose wasn't about the ships themselves. The Navy was spreading construction across multiple shipyards, building industrial capacity. This was strategic planning. When war came, America would need the infrastructure to build destroyers quickly. That foresight would prove critical. The class served through World War I without distinction, which was exactly the point. Reliable mediocrity beat brilliant failures. Destroyer crews operated for weeks at sea, exhausted and cramped in brutal conditions. O'Brien-class ships addressed that reality. 6 ships, 1,050 tons, 29 knots. The class introduced improved fire control systems and better crew accommodations. These seem like minor details. They weren't. Exhausted crews made mistakes. Better living conditions meant better performance. Experience was proving that human factors mattered as much as engineering. O'Brien-class ships served extensively in World War I, primarily on convoy escort duty. They were reliable, unsexy, and effective. Enough was enough. By 1916, European naval warfare had been raging for 2 years. Tucker-class destroyers incorporated those lessons. 6 ships, 1,060 tons, 29.5 knots. Armament standardized at 4 4-inch guns and 8 torpedo tubes. Destroyers were proving essential for convoy escort, submarine screening, and fleet operations across the Atlantic. Tucker represented the culmination of 15 years of American destroyer development. These ships were competent, reliable, and utterly inadequate for what was coming. America needed destroyers by the hundreds. Tucker gave them 6. 18 months. That's how long Sampson-class destroyers required from keel laying to commissioning. 6 ships, 1,111 tons, 29 knots. They entered service just as America entered World War I. The Navy immediately recognized the problem. The war wouldn't wait. The Navy needed a design optimized for mass production, not performance. Sampson represented the end of an era. Destroyers as individually crafted warships. The solution would change destroyer design forever. Caldwell introduced the flush deck design that would define American destroyers for a generation. 6 ships, 1,020 tons, 30 knots. The raised forecastle was eliminated, creating a continuous main deck from bow to stern. This simplified construction enormously. Fewer complex curves, less structural complexity, faster building times. The class also standardized the four-stack arrangement. Caldwell wasn't revolutionary, it was practical. Good enough ships delivered quickly beat perfect ships delivered slowly. Speed to value mattered more than perfection. Wicks took that philosophy and industrialized it. 111 ships. Same flush deck, same four-stack, same 35-knot speed. Wicks-class destroyers represented industrial mobilization at unprecedented scale. Displacement: 1,154 tons. 4 4-inch guns, 12 torpedo tubes. Construction time dropped to 8 months. The Navy had cracked the code on mass production. Wicks-class ships poured from American shipyards faster than crews could be trained. Most arrived too late for significant World War I service. That didn't matter. The infrastructure was proven. America could build destroyers at scale. Clemson would prove they could build even more. Wicks flooded from shipyards. The Navy was already planning something bigger. 156 ships, Clemson-class destroyers, were Wicks on steroids. Same flush deck design, same four-stack silhouette, same 35-knot speed. Displacement increased slightly to 1,190 tons. Fuel capacity increased, extending range. The class was ordered during the war, but mostly delivered after the armistice. By 1921, America had 267 flush-deck destroyers, more than the rest of the world combined. The problem was immediate. They were obsolete. Range was inadequate for Pacific operations. Seakeeping was poor. Machinery was unreliable. Quantity had solved one problem. It created others. Then the Washington Naval Treaty arrived, and everything stopped. 12 years of silence. Not a single destroyer laid down between 1922 and 1932. The Washington Naval Treaty had frozen construction, forcing the Navy to operate aging flush-deckers that grew more obsolete yearly. Farragut broke that stagnation. 8 ships, 1,365 tons, 36.5 knots. This was a complete redesign. Enclosed bridges, improved seakeeping, better crew accommodations, and crucially, dual-purpose 5-inch guns that could engage both surface and air targets. Modern fire control. Range increased to 6,500 nautical miles. These were real warships, not mass-produced scouts. The lessons from European designs had been absorbed. Farragut proved America could build modern destroyers again. Porter proved they could build them powerful. 8 destroyer leaders at 1,850 tons and 37 knots. Armament was extraordinary. 8 5-inch guns in 4 twin turrets. The class was designed to counter Japanese destroyer doctrine, which emphasized heavy torpedo armament and night combat. Porter represented American anxiety about Pacific warfare. The ships were expensive, complex, and ultimately unnecessary. Overcompensation. But they proved that American shipyards could build sophisticated warships again. That capability would matter. Porter's destroyer leaders were impressive, but impractical. Mahan-class destroyers returned to standard fleet destroyer design. 18 ships, 1,500 tons, 36.5 knots. 5 5-inch guns, 12 torpedo tubes. The class introduced the quintuple torpedo mount, 5 tubes in a single rotating launcher. This was American response to Japanese long lance torpedoes. Torpedo warfare remained relevant despite air power's rise. Mahan-class ships had better stability than Farragut, improved fire control, and greater endurance. These were mature designs, incorporating lessons from 2 decades of destroyer operations. While Mahan balanced guns and torpedoes, Gridley emphasized speed and torpedoes above all else. 4 ships, 1,590 tons, 38.5 knots. 4 5-inch guns, 16 torpedo tubes in 4 quadruple mounts. The class represented peak American torpedo doctrine. Speed increased through improved machinery. The Navy was experimenting with high-pressure steam plants, pushing engineering limits. Gridley-class ships were fast, heavily armed, and mechanically complex. Reliability suffered. Cutting-edge technology came with operational costs. But Gridley proved American destroyers could match Japanese speed and torpedo throw weight. Gridley tested the limits. Bagley refined the execution. 8 ships, 1,646 tons, 38.5 knots. 4 5-inch guns, 16 torpedo tubes. The differences were minor, slightly different machinery, different contractors. The Navy was again spreading construction across shipyards, maintaining industrial capacity during peacetime. The class served extensively in World War II, primarily in the Pacific. Several were lost in the brutal surface actions around Guadalcanal. Bagley proved that pre-war destroyers could fight, but they lacked the anti-aircraft armament that war would demand. Summers-class destroyers were the last destroyer leaders. 5 ships, 2,047 tons, 37 knots. 8 5-inch guns, 12 torpedo tubes. The class was expensive and offered marginal advantages over standard destroyers. Standard destroyers could perform command functions adequately. Specialized leaders weren't worth the cost. Summers represented the end of a doctrinal experiment. The ships served through World War II, but no follow-on class was built. One good design built in quantity beat specialized ships built in dozens. Benham-class destroyers returned to torpedo emphasis one final time. 10 ships, 1,657 tons, 38.5 knots. 4 5-inch guns, 16 torpedo tubes. The class was essentially an improved Gridley, with better stability and reliability. Benham represented the last pre-war destroyer design optimized for surface combat. Doctrine still believed destroyer versus destroyer night actions would dominate Pacific warfare. That doctrine would prove partially correct. But what Benham lacked was anti-aircraft capability. The class would be retrofitted repeatedly during the war, adding more guns at the expense of torpedo tubes. It still wouldn't be enough. Benham chased torpedoes. Sims corrected that imbalance. 12 ships, 1,764 tons, 35 knots. 5 5-inch guns, 8 torpedo tubes. The class prioritized gun armament over torpedoes, reflecting growing awareness that air power was changing naval warfare. Sims had improved anti-aircraft capability and better fire control. Speed decreased slightly, but range increased to 6,500 nautical miles. Pacific operations demanded endurance, not sprint speed. Sims represented the transition from pre-war to wartime thinking. The class served extensively, with several losses in early Pacific battles, teaching the lessons that later classes would incorporate. By 1939, the Navy had learned from 15 years of experimentation. Porter's destroyer leaders were too expensive. Gridley's cutting-edge machinery was too complex. What the Navy needed was something reliable, mass-producible, and good enough. Benson-class destroyers established that wartime standard. 30 ships, 1,839 tons, 35 knots. 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes. The class was designed for mass production with improved anti-aircraft armament. Benson introduced the single-stack design, simplifying machinery and reducing construction time. This was deliberately conservative. Proven technology, reliable machinery, straightforward construction. These ships could be built quickly and maintained easily. That counted more than cutting-edge performance. Benson set the standard. Gleaves ran in parallel as insurance. 66 ships, 1,839 tons, 35 knots. The differences were minor: slightly different machinery arrangement, different stack configuration. The Navy was hedging its bets, testing two parallel designs to determine which was superior for mass production. Both classes performed identically in service. The real achievement was production volume. 96 Benson and Gleaves-class destroyers were built, establishing the industrial base for what came next. America was ready. The ships were proven. The war was coming. What came next changed everything. 175 ships. Fletcher-class destroyers with a war-winning design. Displacement 2,325 tons. Speed 36.5 knots. 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and crucially, extensive anti-aircraft armament. Fletcher was larger, more capable, and more survivable than any previous American destroyer. The class incorporated radar, improved damage control, and better crew accommodations. Construction time was 12 months, despite increased complexity. Fletcher-class ships fought in every Pacific campaign, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. They screened carriers, bombarded beaches, fought surface actions, and shot down aircraft. They were everywhere. They were everything. Fletcher won the war. Sumner improved on victory. 70 ships, 2,610 tons, 36.5 knots. 6 5-inch guns in 3 twin turrets, a significant firepower increase over Fletcher's 5 single mounts. Anti-aircraft armament was doubled. The class introduced the twin 5-inch mount, which became standard for post-war destroyers. Sumner was wider than Fletcher, improving stability and allowing more equipment. Destroyers needed to be multi-role platforms. Anti-aircraft warfare was now as important as surface combat. Sumner embodied that doctrinal shift. The ships arrived late in the war, but served extensively in Korea, proving their enduring value. Gearing-class destroyers were the ultimate wartime design, the final evolution of 4 decades of destroyer development. 98 ships, 2,616 tons, 36.5 knots. 6 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, massive anti-aircraft batteries. The class was essentially an Allen M. Sumner with 14 additional feet of hull length, increasing fuel capacity and range. Endurance reached 6,500 nautical miles. Gearing could operate across the Pacific without refueling. Most arrived too late for World War II combat, but the class served through Korea, Vietnam, and into the 1980s. From Bainbridge's 420 tons to Gearing's 2,616 tons. From 29 knots to 36.5 knots. From 2 guns to 6. 43 years of evolution, perfected in a war that lasted 4. The United States Navy in 1883 had no modern warships, just wooden ships built before the Civil War, rotting in harbor. The ABCD program funded 4 steel hulls: Atlanta and Boston as protected cruisers, Chicago as a larger protected cruiser, and Dolphin as a dispatch vessel. Construction began in 1883. They were not a class, they were an experiment, conducted simultaneously on 4 different answers to a question nobody had fully written yet. The cruiser's defining problem announced itself immediately. Every Navy building one had a different idea of what it was for. Chicago, hull number C4, the largest of the early protected cruisers, was the first American steel warship to suggest what the category might actually become. At 4,500 tons, she was fast enough to disengage from what she couldn't fight, and capable enough to threaten what she couldn't outrun. The cruiser formula that would remain unresolved for 60 years. She flew the flag of the Squadron of Evolution in 1891. the Navy's first modern fleet formation. Every officer who served in it was learning what steel warships could do together. None of them had doctrine to work from. The ships would have to generate it themselves. Newark was hull C-1, the first modern protected cruiser the United States actually completed, commissioned before Chicago despite being laid down later. A sloped steel deck designed to deflect shells rather than absorb them. No side armor. Fast and economical. The concept had genuine logic. A ship built around deflection rather than absorption could manage moderate punishment at reduced cost. What Newark demonstrated across 2 decades of colonial patrols was that the formula worked reliably in the conditions the Navy actually operated in, which were rarely the conditions the Navy most feared. USS Baltimore demonstrated something the Navy had not fully calculated: that a modern cruiser in the right place at the right moment was a foreign policy instrument. At the 1891 Valparaiso incident, Baltimore sat in Chilean waters while the United States government issued ultimatums over the killing of 2 American sailors ashore. Chile backed down. The ship hadn't fired a round. The episode established something beyond the incident itself: that presence and capability together could achieve outcomes neither achieved alone. The Navy filed that observation and spent the next century applying it. On May 1, 1898, Commodore Dewey stood on Olympia's bridge in Manila Bay and told his captain to open fire. The engagement lasted 7 hours. The Spanish lost 7 ships. The Americans lost 1 man to heat stroke. At 5,800 tons, fast and well-armed, Olympia was exactly what 15 years of steel Navy building had been working toward. The victory made her famous and required careful reading. The enemy had been badly outmatched. What Manila Bay proved was American naval presence, not American cruiser doctrine. Olympia is still afloat in Philadelphia. She is the oldest steel warship in the world. Columbia and Minneapolis were among the fastest cruisers afloat when they commissioned. 22 knots, driven by massive engines that consumed coal at a rate making extended operations nearly impossible. Too fragile for fleet combat, too fuel-hungry for patrol work, too fast for convoy escort. The Columbia class demonstrated the cruiser's recurring problem in its purest form. Optimizing for a single capability produced a ship exceptional in trials and irrelevant in practice. They were elegant. They went nowhere important. Albany and New Orleans were originally ordered by Brazil, purchased by the United States when Brazil couldn't pay for them. Brazilian designs built in British yards, operating under American colors, fitting no existing doctrine. They were useful ships acquired through procurement rather than planning. The 1890s Navy was building a fleet while simultaneously deciding what kind of fleet it wanted to be. The New Orleans class was less a design choice than an opportunity the budget allowed, which was how much of the Steel Navy got built. 6 ships: Cleveland, Denver, Galveston, Tacoma, Chattanooga, Des Moines, 3,200 tons each, designed for colonial station service in the Philippines and Caribbean. The Denver class were presents: American steel hull in foreign harbors, 300 feet of signal that the flag was there. They established the cruiser's secondary function: not fleet combat, but sustained forward deployment, showing up and staying. Unglamorous work. The ships did it for decades without complaint. St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Charleston were the last protected cruisers the Navy would build, and by the time they commissioned, the category had been overtaken by events. The Russo-Japanese War had shown that armor mattered under real fire. Milwaukee was lost in 1917, not in combat, but attempting to salvage a submarine. She grounded on the Oregon coast in heavy surf and broke apart. The class ended not with a tactical decision, but with the straightforward acknowledgement that the protected cruiser formula had gone as far as it could take the cruiser concept. The next step would require a different kind of ship, The armored cruiser was the Navy's first serious attempt to give the cruiser a coherent identity through firepower. Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Colorado, and Maryland were 13,000-ton ships with 8-inch guns and full belt armor. Fast enough for fleet operations, powerful enough to threaten anything short of a battleship. They occupied a position between lighter cruisers and capital ships, without fully replacing either. The armored cruiser was powerful and perpetually underemployed. The right answer to a tactical question that navies kept rephrasing before anyone could act on the response. Tennessee, Washington, North Carolina, and Montana, 14,500 tons, 4 10-inch guns, the most powerful cruisers afloat when they commissioned. HMS Dreadnought commissioned the same year. The Dreadnought revolution made the armored cruiser's tactical position untenable overnight. Too slow to evade battleships, too lightly armored to engage them. The Tennessee class spent the First World War in convoy escort and troop transport. The peak of the armored cruiser concept had arrived at the exact moment the concept became obsolete. Chester, Birmingham, and Salem, scout cruisers, a category invented to fill the gap between destroyers and cruisers without spending cruiser money. 24 knots, light armament, designed to operate ahead of the fleet and report back. Birmingham made naval history on November 14, 1910, when Eugene Ely flew a Curtiss biplane off a wooden platform built over her bow, the first aircraft to take off from a ship. The Navy noted the demonstration and filed it. The implications would take another decade to become actionable. The Omaha class was the first American cruiser to emerge from the First World War, and it reflected the uncertainty of the moment more than any failure of intent. 10 6-inch guns on a 7,000-ton hull, 34 knots, and structural characteristics that would require reinforcement during service. 10 ships completed 1923 to 1925. The Washington Naval Treaty had just reorganized the world's navies, and the Americans were working out what cruisers were supposed to do in the new framework. The Omaha class answered that question provisionally, filling inventory while the Navy worked towards something more considered. The Washington Naval Treaty gave cruisers a precise definition for the first time: no more than 10,000 tons, no guns larger than 8 inches. The United States immediately built to those exact limits. Pensacola and Salt Lake City carried 10 8-inch guns on 9,100 tons, so top-heavy that both ships rolled badly in any kind of sea and handled poorly in heavy weather. The treaty had defined a cruiser by numbers. It had said nothing about what those numbers were supposed to produce. The Pensacola class was the result. Maximum armament, compromised stability, built to the letter of rules that had no underlying concept behind them. 6 ships: Northampton, Chester, Louisville, Chicago, Houston, Augusta. The Northampton class corrected Pensacola's stability problems at the cost of speed and 1 fewer gun, a more rational weight distribution that could actually be handled in rough weather. Houston carried President Roosevelt on 3 cruises. At Tassafaronga in November 1942, Japanese destroyers using Long Lance torpedoes sank Northampton and damaged 3 more heavy cruisers in 15 minutes. The treaty cruiser had been built within limits that said nothing about the weapons waiting on the other side of the engagement. 2 ships, Portland and Indianapolis. A modest refinement of the Northampton, slightly better protected, marginally more stable. Indianapolis delivered components of the first atomic bomb to Tinian in July 1945, was torpedoed 4 days later, and her crew spent 4 days in the water before anyone realized she was missing. 880 men died, the greatest single-ship loss in US Navy history. The Navy had not known she was overdue. A communication failure that has never been fully explained meant no one was looking for her.
7 ships, and the first American heavy cruisers that actually worked as designed. The New Orleans class absorbed the lessons of the Pensacola and Northampton.
Better armor, improved stability, rational weight allocation, without sacrificing firepower. Minneapolis, New Orleans, Astoria, San Francisco, Quincy, Vincennes, Tuscaloosa. 3 were lost at Savo Island in August 1942 in a single night, sunk by Japanese cruisers in a surface engagement the Americans had not expected to fight in the dark. The New Orleans class was the right answer to the treaty cruiser question. It met a war that had different questions. 1 ship. Wichita was the bridge between the treaty heavy cruiser and what the war would demand. Larger than the New Orleans class, better protected, incorporating everything a decade of treaty construction had taught. She was the last American heavy cruiser designed within treaty constraints. By the time she commissioned, the Washington system was visibly collapsing. Wichita fought across both oceans, survived without serious damage, and was scrapped in 1947. 1 ship that arrived exactly as the rules producing her ceased to apply. 7 ships, 15 6-inch guns each, a battery dense enough to put more steel on a target per minute than most heavy cruisers. The logic was straightforward. Intelligence suggested Japan was building cruisers with 15 6-inch guns, so Brooklyn matched that figure exactly. Helena was sunk at Kula Gulf. Boise took a shell through her forward magazine at Cape Esperance and survived because flooding had already reached the powder before ignition. Phoenix survived the war, was sold to Argentina as General Belgrano, and was sunk by a British submarine in 1982. The only cruiser sunk by a submarine since the Second World War, in a war 37 years after she was built. 2 ships, St. Louis and Helena, an improved Brooklyn with better armor and fire control, the same 15-gun battery. Helena was sunk at Kula Gulf in July 1943. St. Louis survived the war, was sold to Brazil, and served until 1980. The class is the endpoint of the interwar light cruiser program. By 1939, the Navy had worked out what it wanted. Within 2 years, a different war would ask for something no peacetime design had fully prepared. The Atlanta class was built around a question without operational validation. What does a cruiser do when the threat comes from above? 8 twin 5-inch mounts, optimized for anti-aircraft fire. A ship designed for the sky that died in a surface battle. Atlanta and Juneau were both sunk at Guadalcanal in November 1942. Atlanta fell to Japanese gunfire in a night action so confused that American ships were firing at each other in the dark. A single torpedo found Juneau's magazine. She took 687 men down with her, including all 5 Sullivan brothers. The category that had been invented for air defense paid for it in a gun engagement. 27 completed as cruisers. 9 additional hulls were converted to Independence-class light carriers while still under construction, because the Navy needed flight decks more urgently than gun cruisers. The Cleveland class was industrial mobilization applied to ship design. A standard, repeatable hull built quickly across multiple yards, capable in every category, exceptional in none. The Cleveland class is the wartime Navy in miniature. Practical, numerous, built for the arithmetic of attrition rather than the precision of design. 2 ships, Fargo and Huntington, a Cleveland refinement with a revised superstructure that improved fire arcs and reduced top weight. Both commissioned after the war ended. Neither fired a shot. The Fargo class was the terminal point of the American light gun cruiser. Every lesson of the war incorporated into a clean design that arrived too late for the war generating those lessons. The formula had been perfected at the moment it ceased to matter. 14 ships, 13,600 tons, 9 8-inch guns, and no treaty constraining them. The Baltimore class was what a decade of treaty-era compromise had been trying to produce without the numbers allowing it. Heavy armor, serious anti-aircraft battery, guns designed to survive the engagements that had destroyed the earlier classes. Canberra was torpedoed by Japanese aircraft in 1944 and required a year of repairs. Pittsburgh lost her bow in a typhoon in 1945. The bow was found floating separately and towed to port. The Baltimore class fought the last 2 years of the war the treaty cruisers had been built for and couldn't fully fight. 4 ships: Albany, Rochester, Northampton, Oregon City. A Baltimore refinement with modified superstructure, improving top weight and anti-aircraft arcs. The peak of American heavy gun cruiser design. Everything the Baltimore had done more efficiently. Albany was later rebuilt as a guided missile cruiser with an entirely new superstructure. Oregon City herself commissioned in 1946 and decommissioned in 1947 without ever deploying operationally. The heavy gun cruiser concept fully realized, arriving into a world already moving past the gun. 2 ships built, Alaska and Guam. The Alaska class was the Navy's attempt to create a category that didn't exist. Larger than a treaty cruiser, comparable in size to early treaty battleships, capable of hunting Japanese cruisers while escorting fast carrier task forces. 34,000 tons, 12 12-inch guns. The Navy called her a large cruiser. The classification satisfied no one. Too expensive for cruiser missions, not powerful enough for battleship missions. The 4 remaining hulls cancelled in 1947. The Alaska class is the cruiser's identity crisis expressed in steel. A ship that couldn't decide what it was built to be. 3 ships, Des Moines, Salem, Newport News, and the most powerful gun cruisers ever built. 8-inch automatic guns firing 10 rounds per minute, 3 times the rate of any previous heavy cruiser. Salem survives at Quincy, Massachusetts, the only preserved heavy cruiser in the world. Newport News fired her guns off Vietnam in 1972, the last time an American cruiser used its main battery in combat. The Des Moines class commissioned into a Navy already moving past the gun. The answer perfected at the moment the question was withdrawn. 2 ships, Worcester and Roanoke, the last American light cruisers and among the most mechanically sophisticated gun cruisers ever built. 12 6-inch automatic guns in 6 twin mounts, capable of anti-aircraft fire as well as surface combat, requiring a crew of over 1,000 to operate. Both rendered obsolete by missiles before demonstrating their potential. Worcester decommissioned in 1958, 10 years after commissioning. The final expression of the gun cruiser concept taken to its logical extreme, arriving as the concept itself became irrelevant. Boston and Canberra were Baltimore-class heavy cruisers rebuilt with Terrier surface-to-air missile systems replacing the aft gun turrets. Not new ships, an improvisation. The Navy had missiles needing a platform, and existing hulls were available. The conversions produced an awkward hybrid. Forward 8-inch guns intact, aft missile system installed, a ship that satisfied no operational requirement cleanly. Boston and Canberra were the acknowledgement that the missile age had arrived before anyone had designed a ship to carry it properly. The answer would take another decade to develop. 6 Cleveland-class light cruisers converted to carry Talos or Terrier missiles, redesignated from CL to CLG. Galveston, Little Rock, Oklahoma City, Providence, Springfield, Topeka. Single missile systems on hulls designed for guns, maintenance demands that made them expensive to sustain. Little Rock survives as a museum ship in Buffalo. The conversions were transitional in the most literal sense. The Navy knew it needed missile cruisers, hadn't designed one from scratch yet, and was adapting existing inventory while working out what the next generation should be. The first purpose-built missile cruiser in the world, and the first nuclear-powered surface combatant. Long Beach carried no traditional cruiser gun battery when she commissioned. 2 twin Terrier launchers forward, Talos aft. 14,000 tons, built entirely around the proposition that the gun era had ended. 5-inch guns were added later,
an acknowledgement that it hadn't ended entirely. Long Beach served until 1995, the only ship of her class. The Navy had built one vision of the future and then decided the future was too expensive to repeat. 9 ships, double-ended missile cruisers, Terrier launchers fore and aft, initially no guns, later modified when pure missile armament proved insufficient for all scenarios. Reclassified from frigates to cruisers in 1975, a designation change that solves nothing about what they actually were. The cruiser had become a title the Navy applied to capable surface combatants whose specific identity remained, as always, unclear. Not battleship, not destroyer, not carrier. Still looking for the right word.
One nuclear-powered ship, built to escort Enterprise and Long Beach in the world's first all-nuclear task force. In 1964, the 3 ships crossed the Pacific together without refueling. The demonstration proved the concept. It did not prove the economy. Nuclear cruisers cost more to build and more to maintain. Bainbridge served until 1996. No sister ships were built. The Nuclear Surface Combatant Program kept producing single ships and small classes, each proving the concept, none cheap enough to justify the numbers that would have made it strategically significant. 9 ships, conventional propulsion, a single missile system forward and a gun aft. The Navy's concession that pure missile armament had been a mistake. The first American cruiser designed from the outset with the gun as part of the weapon system rather than a retrofit. Belknap herself was severely damaged in 1975 when the carrier John F. Kennedy cut through her in a night collision in the Mediterranean. The fire burned for hours. She was rebuilt rather than scrapped because the Navy needed hulls. The Belknap class was the guided missile cruiser reaching a stable formula. Missile coverage above, gun capability below. One nuclear-powered Belknap. The Navy's attempt to produce a nuclear cruiser that was affordable, smaller than Long Beach, simpler than Bainbridge. She cost more than a conventional cruiser and less than Long Beach, satisfying no one entirely. Truxtun served until 1995 and contributed to the California and Virginia designs that followed. One ship of a type the Navy kept wanting to build in numbers and kept finding it couldn't fund. The gap between what the nuclear surface force required and what the budget would support was a problem no single hull could close. 2 ships, California and South Carolina, nuclear-powered cruisers providing long-range air defense for carrier task forces without fuel constraints. Effective ships, expensive ships. Built in an era when Congress acknowledged nuclear surface combatants were valuable and refused to fund enough of them to matter strategically. Both decommissioned in 1999, when reactor refueling costs exceeded what the post-Cold War budget would support. Good ships, too few to change anything. Retired before their reactors ran out. 4 ships, Virginia, Texas, Mississippi, Arkansas. The last nuclear cruisers the United States built. Improved Californias, better weapons integration, same nuclear propulsion, same budget vulnerability. All 4 retired between 1993 and 1999. Reactors not refueled when the cost exceeded the perceived value of keeping them in service. The Nuclear Surface Combatant Program ended not with a decision, but with a series of budget line deletions. The ships had been built for a strategic competition. The competition ended. They outlasted the strategic logic that had justified their cost. 27 ships built on a Spruance-class destroyer hull, armed with the Aegis combat system, officially designated cruisers. The designation was deliberate. The Navy wanted the budget protection the cruiser title carried, applied to a hull that was structurally a destroyer. Ticonderoga-class ships could simultaneously track over 100 targets, coordinate fleet-wide air defense, and guide ballistic missile interceptors. 9 remained active in 2026, with the last scheduled for decommissioning in 2027. The category survived a century.
The definition never did.
The United States Navy was born out of a specific humiliation. In October 1793, Algerian pirates seized 10 American merchant ships in the Mediterranean. The Republic had no warships to respond. Congress argued. Then it authorized 6 frigates in 1794, not ships of the line, which would have provoked Britain, and not gunboats, which would have accomplished nothing. The frigate was a political compromise that became a strategic doctrine. Fast enough to outrun anything it couldn't fight, powerful enough to destroy anything it could catch. USS United States was the first laid down, built not just to protect commerce, but to prove that the United States was a nation that other nations had to take seriously. August 1812. Off Nova Scotia, USS Constitution encountered HMS Guerriere, a vessel the Royal Navy considered adequate for any American warship, and in fewer than 30 minutes of close action, reduced her to a dismasted wreck. British shot bounced off Constitution's thick live oak hull, producing the nickname Old Ironsides. The engagement did not change the balance of Atlantic naval power. It changed how Americans understood what their navy was for. A country that had defeated a British frigate in open battle could not be dismissed as a maritime irrelevance. Constitution has never been decommissioned. She is still a commissioned United States Navy warship. Built entirely by private subscription, the citizens of Salem, Massachusetts funded her as a patriotic contribution. USS Essex was smaller and lighter than Constitution, designed for speed and commerce raiding, rather than the heavyweight duels that Constitution preferred. In the War of 1812, Essex sailed to the Pacific under David Porter, becoming the first United States Navy warship in those waters, destroying the British whaling industry and threatening supply lines across an ocean the Royal Navy had considered entirely its own. She was caught by 2 British ships, outgunned, not outfought. Essex proved American frigates could project power to any ocean. Ships like Adams, John Adams, and Brandywine followed the same idea across the same oceans. December 1812. A British frigate sailed into New York Harbor flying American colors, captured and sailed home by USS United States under Stephen Decatur. The British Admiralty could dismiss Constitution's victory over Guerriere as an anomaly. Macedonian was harder to explain. She was a newer ship, well-handled, crewed by experienced men, beaten by a ship British doctrine held should have been inferior. The shock in London was considerable. The celebration in New York was extraordinary. Macedonian was commissioned into the United States Navy and served for decades. She was not merely a trophy. She was evidence that the American frigate program could meet the finest European navy on equal terms and win. The Navy's attempt to enter the age of steam without abandoning sail produced the Merrimack class of 1855. Large screw frigates capable of operating under both engine and canvas, the pinnacle of American frigate design. USS Merrimack herself was commissioned in 1856. In 1861, she was captured by Confederate forces at Norfolk, cut down to her waterline, and rebuilt as the ironclad CSS Virginia. In March 1862, Virginia destroyed 2 Union frigates in Hampton Roads, rendering every wooden warship in every navy on Earth obsolete in a single afternoon. The ship built to modernize the United States fleet ended up proving the fleet itself was already obsolete. The most powerful conventional warship the United States Navy had ever put to sea ran aground trying to fight. On the 8th of March, 1862, CSS Virginia attacked the Union squadron at Hampton Roads, and USS Minnesota, largest of the Merrimack class, became helpless on a shoal, waiting for Virginia to return and finish her in the morning. USS Monitor arrived overnight and fought Virginia to a standstill. Minnesota survived,
but her survival clarified nothing so much as her vulnerability. The most powerful wooden warship in the American fleet had been rendered helpless not by another wooden warship, but by armor that conventional cannon could not penetrate. The era of the wooden frigate was over.
Flagship of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. Veteran of the capture of Port Royal in 1861, USS Wabash was immensely capable by the standards of 1860. By 1865, she was already an anachronism, a wooden steam frigate in a world that had demonstrated beyond argument that wooden steam frigates had no future in major naval combat. Wabash continued as a receiving ship and training vessel for decades, her hull useful long after her fighting days ended. The Navy found purposes for her. It could not find a purpose for what she represented. The frigate as a category had no successor in American naval thinking for half a century. Still in commission in the 1890s, still showing the flag in ports that steam-powered vessels could not yet reach reliably. A wooden sailing warship in a world of steel battleships and torpedo boats, performing diplomatic functions nothing else in the fleet was assigned to do. USS Lancaster had served for decades as flagship of the Pacific Squadron, and later the European Squadron. The Navy didn't replace her, it simply moved on without her. The frigate, as a concept, had no successor in American naval thinking for half a century. No ship type occupied the role that frigates had filled. The absence was convenient, until it wasn't. CSS Virginia had proven that wooden warships were finished. The Navy's answer was USS New Ironsides, an armored broadside warship that borrowed the frigate's long gun deck and the ironclad's protective plating, producing something that was neither entirely one thing nor the other. She served in the bombardment of Confederate fortifications along the Atlantic coast, absorbing enormous quantities of fire without serious damage, demonstrating that armor had permanently closed the age of the wooden broadside warship. Never quite a battleship, and no longer quite a frigate, the Navy was still working out what warship design meant in the age of iron. Commissioned in 1865 as the last purpose-built sailing frigate in United States Navy history, USS Tennessee arrived into a world that had already concluded sailing frigates had no place in modern warfare. She served for decades in training and as a receiving ship, the final representative of a tradition stretching back to the original 6. Tennessee was not a failure. She was a conclusion. The frigate had been the most capable warship the United States Navy possessed through its first generation. It disappeared not because it had failed, but because technology had moved past the wooden hull and the broadside battery. The Navy would not seriously reconsider the frigate for another 80 years. War forces fast learning. The Tacoma class of 1943 were patrol frigates, PF designation vessels built under a wartime emergency program to provide convoy escort capability at a rate American shipyards could sustain. 143 were ordered across American and British programs. 97 were completed before the war ended. Not glamorous ships, utilitarian, designed to find submarines, protect merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic, fill the gap between the destroyers the fleet needed for combat and the smaller escorts that lacked range for mid-ocean work. The Tacoma class was the United States Navy relearning, under fire, the lesson the frigate existed to teach: that convoy protection requires a ship specifically designed for convoy protection. Single purpose, one threat. The Dealey class of 1954 were the first purpose-built ocean escort vessels the United States Navy had constructed since the Second World War. Small, economical, optimized entirely for anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic against the Soviet submarine fleet that had grown from captured German technology into a genuine strategic threat. USS Dealey displaced 1,877 tons standard. carried no significant surface armament, and was built for finding and killing submarines. The primary threat to American sea power in the Cold War was not surface vessels or aircraft, it was submarines. The Dealey class established the escort frigate as the foundation of American Cold War naval strategy.
2 ships. That was all the Bronstein class ever was. USS Bronstein and USS McCloy, the smallest ocean-going frigates the United States Navy built during the Cold War. Experimental vessels designed to test new anti-submarine warfare systems before committing them to production. They carried the ASROC rocket-delivered torpedo system and the SQS-26 sonar, technologies that would define American ASW capability for a generation. The Bronstein class mattered not because of what they were, but because of what they proved. That the acoustic detection and weapon systems being developed for the Cold War submarine threat actually worked. Every subsequent American frigate carried systems derived from what those 2 ships tested first. What Bronstein and McCloy had proved in miniature, the Garcia class made real at production scale. 15 ships built between 1964 and 1968, each larger, more capable, and better armed than the experimental vessels they translated into doctrine, carrying ASROC, a single 5-inch gun, and sonar equipment that gave them genuine capability against the Soviet submarine fleet. Not fast, not heavily armed by surface combatant standards, specifically and deliberately optimized for the one task Cold War strategy demanded: finding Soviet submarines in the North Atlantic before they could threaten the sea lines of communication that NATO's strategy depended on. The Garcia class was the frigate doctrine made concrete. The Garcia hull, the Garcia mission, and one addition that changed everything. The Brooke class of 1966 replaced the second gun mount with a Tartar surface-to-air missile system, producing a vessel that could defend itself and its convoy against aircraft as well as submarines. 6 ships, designated DEG for their guided missile capability, representing the moment when the American escort frigate became a genuinely multi-mission warship rather than a single-purpose ASW platform. The Brooke class pointed toward what frigates would eventually become. Not specialist hunters, but capable generalists, able to contribute to multiple threat environments simultaneously. The missile changed the mission. The hull remained the same. 46 ships. That was the Cold War frigate doctrine at full scale. Built between 1969 and 1974, each Knox displaced nearly 4,000 tons, carried ASROC and torpedoes for submarine hunting, a single 5-inch gun for surface defense, and from 1971, a Sea Sparrow launcher retrofitted to address the air threat the original design had underweighted. The Knox class served in every ocean and was exported to Allied navies across the world. If you want to understand how that system worked, the books and models linked below go into it in detail. The Knox was not a glamorous warship. It was the workhorse that made American naval presence global during the most dangerous decades of the Cold War. Affordable. That was the explicit, unapologetic design goal. A frigate the Navy could build in large numbers, rather than leave critical gaps in escort coverage with a small number of expensive ships. USS Oliver Hazard Perry carried a single-arm missile launcher for air defense, a 76mm gun, 2 helicopters, and hull-mounted sonar. Slower than the Knox it supplemented, less heavily armed than the destroyers it operated alongside, specifically intended for lower-threat convoy escort. 71 were built for the United States Navy. Licensed for production in Australia, Spain, Taiwan, and Egypt, the most widely deployed Western frigate of its generation. On the 17th of May, 1987, 2 Exocet missiles fired by an Iraqi aircraft struck USS Stark in the Persian Gulf, killing 37 sailors
and demonstrating that the Perry class had been designed for a threat environment that no longer existed. The single-arm missile launcher was not activated. The ship's systems had not detected the attack in time to respond. Stark burned for hours, saved by damage control, brought to Bahrain under her own power. The inquiry that followed changed how the Navy thought about frigate survivability, electronic warfare integration, and the false economies of designing warships for low-threat scenarios. The Perry class had been built for Cold War convoy escort. She was operating in a shooting war. A hole blown in her keel, her back broken. On the 14th of April 1988, USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine in the Persian Gulf and came within hours of going down. She did not sink. Her crew fought flooding and fire through the night. She was loaded onto a heavy lift vessel and transported to a United States shipyard for repairs that took over a year. The damage was catastrophic. The survival was remarkable. Roberts demonstrated that the Perry class had been built with enough structural integrity and enough trained crew to survive damage that would have destroyed a less well-built or less well-drilled ship. The frigate that nearly died became a symbol of what frigates were for. The last Perry-class frigate commissioned in 1989, and when the class began retiring in 2010, it left a gap the service would spend the next decade failing to fill. The Perry class had not been perfect. Its air defense criticized since the 1980s, its missile launcher removed from most ships in the mid-1990s as a cost measure. But it had been present, available, deployable, capable of the sustained presence missions that destroyers were too valuable to perform. When the last Perry departed, the Navy lost the ship type that had historically filled the gap between high-end combatants and missions requiring a capable but expendable presence. That gap would prove expensive. The answer was wrong. It just took years to admit it. The Navy conceived the littoral combat ship as a fast, modular, reconfigurable surface combatant that could optimize for different mission sets by swapping out mission packages. USS Freedom was the steel monohull variant, fast, small, designed for coastal operations rather than the open ocean escort work frigates had traditionally performed. She could not defend a convoy against submarine attack with the reliability Knox and Perry had provided. What the Navy had tried to replace the frigate with performed none of the frigate's traditional functions adequately. The idea was wrong. The execution made it worse. Where Freedom had failed in the monohull, USS Independence failed in the trimaran. Wider, faster on calm water, even less suited to sustained open ocean operations. The Independence class demonstrated that the Navy had fundamentally reconceived what it wanted from a small surface combatant, prioritizing speed in coastal environments over the seakeeping, survivability, and weapons capacity that had defined the frigate. 40 vessels produced at cost substantially exceeding projections, with capabilities substantially below requirements. The Navy eventually acknowledged that the littoral combat ship was not a frigate and could not perform frigate missions. It had taken 20 years and billions of dollars to relearn the lesson the Perry retirement had made urgent. An acknowledgement of two mistakes: cancelling the Perry class without a replacement and believing the littoral combat ship could fill the gap. USS Constellation is the Navy's answer to both. 7,000 tons, SPY-6 radar, a 16-cell evolved Sea Sparrow launcher, a Mark 41 vertical launch system, a 57mm gun, and a full anti-submarine warfare suite. Not a low-end ship filling a gap. A capable, multi-mission combatant that costs more than the Perry class it replaces and is more capable. The frigate had returned, not because the Navy wanted it, but because it had run out of ways to replace it.